Hello, welcome back to our class in Organizational Communication. Today we'll talk about Chapter 2 from our textbook. Read it. It's a bit wordy. Recognize with 3 authors in the textbook. Each one of them adds their expertise to every chapter. But overall the book is not 500 pages long. It's very doable for this course, even in 8 weeks. Or even in 4 weeks you can read this. But what we'll try to do here today is go over the main ideas from the chapter. Now, defining organizational communication. If you're looking for a one-sentence definition in this chapter, you're not going to find it. What it does instead is offers 4 models of how communication operates or can operate within organizations. And each organization tends to adopt one of those models. It tends to come from the communication style and patterns of probably a very influential person in the founding of the organization. Out of this come a lot of the cultural rules we mentioned in our Chapter 1 lecture about communicating. Is it okay to ask questions, or do you keep your mouth shut? Is it okay to make suggestions if you've only been there a year? Or do you need to be there 10 years before anybody will take you seriously? All of these rules are worked out in the practice of communication. And so those rules go hand in hand with these different communication models. And what we're wanting to do is get a grasp of these 4 models here. You're going to be writing about them for me in essay number 1, explaining each one of the models, defining it, explaining it, giving me a metaphor for that model or some way to really grab onto it, and then talking about its pros and cons. So a good solid paragraph on each one of those is what I expect in the essay. So take this chapter seriously. All right, so as a definition, it offers 4 models. The first one of those is communication as an information transfer. It's the metaphorical pipeline model of communication, or the telegraph wire. Things move one way, especially through a pipeline. It's a one-way type transfer of information. Here are the instructions on how to do your job. Now go do your job and don't bother me. I'm busy. Here is your employee manual. 6 months later. What? You have been written up for this? It was right there in the employee manual, and you should have read it. Right there on page 351. You see where we're getting with this, and I'm already starting to talk about one of the problems with this approach. You can't be sure when you're a manager or a boss that the information you give somebody, that they even get it, that they understand it. Communication does go a little deeper than that. This model of communication comes, I believe, from the military. Military, the oldest organization in the world, perhaps. And in the military, you follow orders. You do what you're told. Hopefully you have somebody smart at the top. And if you don't, your whole organization may not last very long in that kind of situation. But this information transfer is very authoritarian. Here's the baton. Take it and do it. Here are your instructions. Here's the message. Here's the memo. Do what the memo says. Here's the email. Here's the text. It goes one way. Now, of course, all communication media that work with this model in mind can work 2 ways. So it's really more about the attitude of the people at the top who are passing down information, and you are to receive it and do your job. In my view, this is not a good model for organizations, yet you find it many places. I worked under this at a nuclear power plant, and orders came down and you did things exactly the way they wanted it, and your job was on the line if you made mistakes, not to mention willfully doing something a different way. All right, the next model the book discusses is communication as a transactional process. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. And this model probably began to develop, I'm going to say in the 1960s, as this one-way model of information flow began to show its problems with larger organizations and in the face of competition. With the transactional process, messages go both ways. People are listening. There's a nice picture in the textbook. People are listening, they're interpreting, they're understanding, they're asking questions, you're restating your instructions. You're giving somebody an employee manual, yes, but maybe you have a class with your HR department that kind of walks everybody through it and gives them a chance to answer questions. And you have an employee there that explains what's really important in that manual and the other things that nobody really looks as closely at by implication because they don't cover it. So a transactional process has improved communication. In fact, this was interesting. I was sitting at my coffee table this morning having a cup of coffee and reading, and my wife is sorting through old books and taking things down to the secondhand store and cleaning up our messy house. And here was a book, I'm Okay, You're Okay. And I saw that book and I remembered, the book that came out a decade later in the 70s. That one was actually published in the 60s. My mother had that book. I'm a Jerk, You're a Jerk came out later. And that title, though, isn't what caught my eye. It was the subtitle. It was written by a medical doctor, and in the 1960s, who knew more about anything than medical doctors? The rest of the social sciences were really fledgling compared to medicine. And this medical doctor's subtitle was A Transactional Analysis. And I thought, well, that's interesting. There's that word, transaction. And so this whole idea of transactions and relationships that go both ways was coming on its own in the 1960s and thereafter. And even the books that probably followed his, satiring the title a little bit but having their own take on things, probably still used a transactional model at the heart of them. In organizations where you have a transactional process, there is a suggestion box. That suggestion box doesn't just have a chute that leads to the waste paper can on the other side. Somebody does read it. It may be a lower level employee that sorts through them and hands the one or two good ones up the line, but it's there and it's used. And communication with this model can be very good, especially in smaller companies where you know everybody, the 20 people you work with at the office or at your small factory, or you even know the 50 or 60 people you work with at a medium-sized factory or in some larger organization. You get closer to some of them, but there's relationships happening. Information flow, probably not much relationship there between hierarchy levels. With the transactional process, there is. All right, I'll just digress here a minute. There's a really good book written by Roger Ailes, A-I-S-L-E-S, and it's about communicating at work. And the title escapes me, but what he offers in that book, that's I think from the 80s, is a model for employee evaluations and employee communication within organizations. And it's a 6-part model. Don't have a slide here, but it's pretty simple. 6 basic questions. So, what's my job? Managers need to answer that. What is your job? Yeah, we do cover this in a later lecture. How am I doing? And we finally come around to, once all these questions are answered, an employee naturally will say, well, how can I help? Some of the other questions, how do we fit in? How do I fit in? How do we fit in as a unit to the larger picture? Employees need to know all these things, and it happens through transaction. And Ailes also says something interesting. The annual review, bad idea. People need monthly reviews maybe, but it only needs to be a couple of minutes long, not a big hairy thing and 30-minute meeting with the boss. Just every month, just a quick meeting. Here's how you're doing. Here's how you're doing. And just here's 1 or 2 things to improve on. Pat on the back, a couple of things to improve. And this is the most effective way to use something out of this transactional model to keep employee morale high, to keep employee commitment high, and to really keep people in the loop, so to speak, in this communication process within an organization. All right. The next model, our third one, is called communication as strategic control. Or strategic control is the key term there. And this perspective of communication is much like the information flow, yet it's more subtle, it's more nuanced and refined. It can be more devious. I used kind of a darker image here of the chessboard and somebody knocking over the king there on the chessboard. what we have going on with this model is persuasion. Leaders and organizations, it tends to be a top-down kind of organization that uses this model, but they persuade you to do your job well, rather than threaten you so much, although the threats, are often always built in. You could lose your job. That's a pretty big threat for anybody. But it's based more on persuasion, and whether or not this model of communication takes a dark path or stays up on ethical grounds depends on the leadership of your organization. If they tend to be sociopathic, look out. This is one of the favorite methods of communicating for the sociopathic corporate CEO, and there's a lot of them. We'll have a reading later. If you have an organization with a very strong, powerful person at the top who is creative and really runs things tight but still persuades, you have to look at the nature of it. Are you persuading in the employee's best interests? Are you persuading in the company's best interests? Is the persuasion ethical that's going on? And I did some consulting work and some video work for a company like this back in Dayton, Ohio, a telecommunications company. And their leader was a very inspirational, powerful leader. He started all sorts of companies, but he had his one central company that did the best. And he really did care about people, and he tried to help you improve your skills. He encouraged people. Once a week he had a meeting telling people his vision and telling people how they were doing and encouraging the employees. And everybody loved working for him. He was tough. He fired people if it needed to happen. He had to change plans once in a while, and he would apologize that your unit may be getting cut. He'd try to place people in other jobs. But everybody liked him. Yet he did use this model, but he did it in a very ethical way that nobody really had a problem with. It wasn't information flow, it was more than that. It was transactional, yet most everything came from him down and was persuasive in nature. I've also worked for companies, a former university where the chancellor, I've got a few stories slipping out about this situation, used this means of communication, yet at the same time he ran a tight ship. It was going to be done his way, but he didn't care who he ran over. He didn't care if you stayed there or not. If you didn't get behind him, he'd get out of here. He had no interest in you. If he didn't have a use for you, or you started to think you were in a more transactional environment where your ideas mattered, even as a senior faculty member, it didn't. He would take action against you, and some people told me he had a very long memory, and someday, somewhere, he would not do you favors where you had expected a normal boss would do that, or he would move you to a crappy part of the building, give you an office in the basement. Those type of things he did regularly. Strategic control, though, very good speech giver. Those inspirational speeches to the whole university 2 or 3 times a year, the emails out to everybody, well crafted. He had an excellent public relations marketing person come in who they did a good job at helping the university get on solid financial ground during the crisis, but they did it by unethical means and showed happy, wonderful, beautiful students on our campus that were just professional models they had hired. They weren't pictures from our students. Get our students out of the way. They weren't good looking enough. And later on they did start using our own students, but this was after they had sports teams and really good looking young people coming to school there that they could use for their models. As well, our communication department was growing, and with a lot more people for them to choose from for their public relations efforts. Beware of this. Strategic ambiguity is one of the methods used. Here's a message, and one of the things that happened to that university by a mid-level administrator was, he said that came in 2008, things were looking bad, 2009, 2010, the economy was crappy, and he came in and said, we're all going to have to work a lot harder. Okay, fair enough. And he kept that promise, that's for sure. But he also said we may have to lay off some faculty members. Well, what a manipulative thing to do. 6 of our faculty members out of, I think about 80, that's nearly 10% in our area, found new jobs before the end of the year and left. He didn't have to lay off anybody. They walked out, and these were associate professors who had already earned tenure even, very energetic, talented people walked out because they started getting afraid for their jobs, that they might not last. And of course, he didn't hire professors to replace them, he hired lecturers who came in at a lower cost. But just today, we may have to let some faculty go. Well, that's kind of specific, but the word may, a little ambiguity there. Is he really going to do this or not? He didn't say we're going to have to cut back by 10% on our faculty by the end of the year. And of course, nothing ever came of his threats there. Other ways to be strategically ambiguous are just simply messages that can be read a couple of ways. And people always tend to interpret messages in the way that fits their view of the world. And people that are good at strategic control methods of communicating know how to put those messages right in the middle to let you interpret things one way or another. And so beware of this. You have examples, and you've seen this in operation most likely. All right, let's move on to this fourth model of communication. And this model, little more of a mouthful, communication as a balance of creativity and constraint. Section on structuration here in this, as they define this. And of course, this is the model that the authors of the textbook have put forward as the ideal. They have an investment in it. It's not one I think you'll even see in other textbooks, though you will see those other 3 models in some other texts. But I kind of like the model. I'd like a catchier name for it than this. That would help with teaching, but here we are. Structuration theory is simply that theory, kind of like, it's related to psychology, the self-fulfilling prophecy. But in its essence, with structuration theory, is something, some organization gets started with its own practices and its own culture begins, it reinvents itself each generation really in its same image, and it just gets larger. And change happens very slowly, and change can happen, but change does take a generation. I'll post a short video on structuration theory. I'm not asking any questions about this or expecting you to grasp it, unless you're interested. Okay, as a balance of creativity and constraint, let's just look at that. In communication, we want to have creativity. We want transactions. We want people saying, hey, I've got an idea, let me share this with you. Or are you sure this is the best way to do things, because I see a problem down the road. That's creativity popping into somebody's head right in a meeting as they analyze a situation. We want to have that in the way we communicate in an organization. The constraint, though, are there's rules about how we communicate. At some level, the boss probably gets more talk time in a meeting than everybody else. Other rules are that, meeting times are limited. You just can't go on and on and on about your ideas for the whole hour. We have other things to talk about. So we have these rules about how we communicate. You never want a company where junior level employees can cuss out their supervisors, setting an example for all the new employees and the rest of the company. There has to be rules about communication that are social, that are good, and we'll get into a few of those general ones here in a minute. But at the same time, let's not squelch the creativity the way it is with information flow models or with strategic control models. Not much creativity happens there unless it's consultants coming in to advise the CEO, and the CEO is paid dearly for their advice and then takes it as his own brilliance and passes it off to the whole company, or uses it. I don't want to be too cynical about it. So, creativity, that's really good. Rules, gotta have them. And but let's find the balance between those and not shut down the creativity and not overrun the rules. And this is probably much more of a transactional model in its essence as it gets walked out every day. But it's different in transactional models, and it really does encourage that creative side. But keeps a bridle on that horse so it doesn't run away with things and cause trouble. All right, now of course the book has much deeper explanations of all four of these communication models: information flow, transactional, strategic control, and this balance. So read through this closely, look at all the details and the nuances the book talks about. All right, the last half of the chapter here discusses dialogue in communicating. Sorry, I spelled dialogue here right, I think, or there's a couple spellings of it. I suppose this one's okay. Dialogue is two people communicating, two groups communicating, even more than one person, 3, 4, 5, anywhere that it's not just you in your own monologue with no listening, the information approach, but anytime we do have transactions occurring, which does happen in the other three models to a large degree, more or less, we need to be mindful in how we communicate, and there are several aspects of that. Okay, number one, it's mindful. You think before you speak. Don't just blurt out everything you say. I think it was, what's today? Thursday, just Tuesday this week. We got a memo saying that pay is going to be cut for our winter and summer teaching sessions. And I looked at what my pay would be, and I was disappointed, thought that really doesn't save them much money. But as I looked deeper into the policy, I saw that our senior level faculty really had their pay cut almost by 50%. And I thought that that's not good. That will actually hurt the budget. I don't think they've done the math. And so I wrote a letter to our department head and our director, and included the mathematics of, if just one of us decides not to teach, here's how it affects the budget. If two or more of us decide not to teach, this is really hurting you far more than you save. In fact, it hurts more than they save just with one person backing out. And I thought I might be that person that backs out. I don't know that I want to teach a class for that pay. And wrote this all up, and it's sitting there on your email. And there's your finger on the mouse hovering over the send button, and I just thought, let's just wait. The next morning I got up and read it early, 6 o'clock, having my coffee, and I rewrote the letter and made it much different. And again, finger hovering over the mouse button. And no, just don't send it yet. Let's go on down to the campus and let's talk to some colleagues. I get down to campus, and oh boy, the senior faculty especially were roaming around the halls talking to one another about this policy, and none of them liked it at all. And I had just about decided, okay, I'm not going to teach. I have to make a stand here. You can't keep cutting the pay because it's not going to stop when cost-cutting measures get going in an organization. They tend to really go on, and especially given the circumstances here. And by about 10 o'clock, I got an email. One of the senior faculty members says to me, go look at your email. And so I looked, and here was an email from our leaders of our college, School of Social and Behavioral Sciences, and I said, okay, never mind, oops, that was a mistake, we're not going to do that. And so I'm glad I was mindful and didn't send those emails. Actually, the problem took care of itself for now. It's caused me to think through it, and if the problem pops up again, I think I know where my position will be and what my role will be in any change. But just thinking before you do things, before you say something, especially when you're going to be critical. And being critical often has to be done kind of in reverse. Is one way to approach it. And let's look at the results of a policy. Here's the end game here. And now let's start backing up the line. At some point, you probably don't need to point fingers if your critiques and your analysis are valid as you critique. Somebody can take it from there without pointing out somebody in public that you're the idiot that came up with this policy that cost the school $6 million. Nobody wants that pointed right at them, but you can still be mindful about how you communicate and get the important messages across when needed without damaging relationships. And that's the real danger here. When communication goes awry, relationships get damaged. An equitable transaction and dialogue. Do you even have the same amount of talk time? Or does it get very one-sided? Are men's opinions valued more than women's opinions in the meeting rooms? Are minorities discriminated against? The universities, I'm talking about their talk time in a meeting room. In the university, we're pretty good about all that. We've been aware of these issues for a couple of decades now, and I think have a lot of respect for one another. Yet there is still, the junior faculty probably don't get as much talk time as senior level faculty. Fair enough, but we still need to listen to junior level faculty, especially since they were the A students and they have PhDs and they're young and full of ideas. And yes, from your 20s to 30s, 35, your brain has more ideas than you know what to do with. And you can keep that going as you age, but we do our best creative work when we're young. That's fairly well known throughout philosophy. Tend to refine it and get more sophisticated as we get older. Is your communication equitable? Are opinions valued equally? Is talk time given equally? Does everybody read your memo, or is it just put in the trash or even goes into the spam, or you don't even have the privilege to post to your listserv for your organization? Dialogue is empathic conversation. And really, we're human beings. We're emotional. We're driven by emotions much of the time. And as we communicate with one another and work out relationships, build relationships, and live through them every day at work, do you understand what your coworkers are going through? Do you understand things from the boss's perspective? Do your employees understand things from your perspective? Empathic, we need to connect with one another at this human level, really. It's not just about orders and tasks and procedures and policy. And we have to be aware of all that. Very nice little inset in the book about policy as strategic ambiguity or as strategic communication. Who makes policy? Everything gets blamed on policy. Well, we just don't do it that way. Here's the policy. When the person standing right back behind the door is the one that wrote the policy just last week. I kind of got out of order there, but I wanted to point out that little inset in the textbook. Okay, we are human. We have emotions. Those have to be taken as part of the equation in all of our relationships at work and all of our tasks and communicating at work. Finally here, dialogue is real meeting. Did you in fact communicate, or were people tuned out? Were they doing this the whole time during the meeting, or answering emails on their laptop? Did the communication even happen? Were people afraid to speak out? Did you have a groupthink problem going where people had reservations but were afraid to speak up? Here's the little cartoon, of course. Okay, this is why we lived on 3. Obviously, patients on the floor behind the doctors. And real meeting, was the communication effective? Sometimes we assume it is when it's not, and we do need to look at this to be sure. Finally, the book closes with its section on ethics. Ethics is a very difficult thing to teach these days. Any religious foundation for ethics just probably isn't appreciated in a secular university, though that is, when I compare that to a seminary, let's say seminary universities of any type of religion. And it's that whole separation of church and state, and most of our culture really doesn't understand the intent behind that. That Thomas Jefferson just didn't want the church running the government the way they did in England in the 1700s and well after that, and the way it is done in many countries throughout the world. It didn't mean Jefferson didn't want churches teaching ethics and morals to the people. He spoke on that, he wrote about that, and he did want those things. But here we are today trying to teach ethics without being able to say thou shalt not, because, and it's the because part that gets troublesome. Yet, as you dive into it, any system of ethics is very practical in nature. And if you dig in, you'll see it's about community, it's about relationships, it's about treating people well, which means you're telling the truth to people. You're not manipulating or lying. You're not stealing from people. All of these things tear down a community. And an organization is a small community. And whatever you do that hurts people or tears down that community damages the organization, It damages a neighborhood, a family, an entire society, a community in general, are damaged by certain actions, stealing, lying, go down the list if you like. But at the heart of that, you'll see much of it is centered around the health of the community, the survival of the community, because we are collectivistic beings in this world. We're not individuals fending for ourselves. America tends to be more that way, but it's really not. We know we prosper more directly. Even if you're self-employed, you have business associates, you have people that hire you and give you contracts, and you're still in a community. And you still have to follow rules of that community. So these ethics, those rules, are essential in organizations, that they're adhered to, that they're clear to everybody. Okay, nice little drawing, they're made up of your beliefs, your words, your actions, all of that forms integrity, all of that. Right and wrong ethics, you know what's right and wrong. I'll just appeal to your internal sense of right and wrong. And it may just come down to doing things that hurt people is wrong. And I know what hurts people because I know what hurts me, and I'm a person. And so what our problem is sociopathic people, or people that lean that way or are nurturing sociopathic tendencies, especially as a young person, tend to do what's best for themselves, almost in all cases, rather than what's best for the organization, for the community, for your work team, even for the person at the desk next to you. So all of this together, being mindful, being ethical, having dialogue, is what it takes to be successful, to have that whatever kind of communication model your organization has, that probably has somewhere underneath there, if it's ethical and mindful, a transactional mechanism within it where people are really relating with one another. You can read through the lines here. I'm not too hot with information transfer models, but elements of them are necessary. You do have to have employee manuals. The transactional process needs a little more than it's provided. The strategic control, in my view, is just the information flow in disguise, and using persuasion rather than threats, and hitting people over the head with a hammer to get them to do what you want. And then finally, the balancing of creativity and constraint. Now we're getting back to somewhere it's more transactional, but it's got that creativity worked in, yet recognizing you got to have the rules. Information flow has too many rules. Strategic control has a lot of rules, and many of them are arbitrary depending on the CEO you've got. But that creativity and constraint is the model our authors have concluded leads the best way into the future. I'll stand behind him on this one at this point until somebody comes up with a better model. I still would like a better name for that one. All right, thanks for watching. And SA2 is